Now, there's a concept in epidemiology called R naught, and this is the basic reproductive number. And with the new coronavirus, this is estimated to be 2.2. SARS was 3. Now, what does this mean? That on average, one person who has got the disease with this new coronavirus, based on the current data, will infect 2.2 people. So we have one person who starts off with the disease. This could be in China or it could be in a new country. This first person, person 1, is called the index case, the first person. And on average, they're going to infect 2 people. So they're going to infect 2 people. Actually 2.2, but it's harder to draw. And on average, each of those is going to infect another 2.2. So we've now end up with over 4 people. And again, they're going to infect an average of 2 each. So now we have 8 people infected. And on average, they can infect, I think you get the idea. But one of the problems is there's already been a lot of travel out of the infected area. Now, I don't particularly like flying, but sometimes you have to. And aeroplanes are just such stuffy places. You're sitting right close next to someone, and obviously, especially like me, you fly economy, of course. You know, you're right next to people. They can be coughing and sneezing and breathing and spluttering and snoring, and they can be giving out all sorts of organisms. And even when there's no epidemics around, I always get an infection when I've been on the plane. I'm always coughy or sneezy afterwards. I always seem to pick up some respiratory bug as a result of my air travel. And the airlines might correct me on this, but as far as I know, only 50% of the air in airlines is new. The rest of it's recirculated. So the air's getting circulated quite a bit. So travel is taking place via sort of these mobile aluminium tube incubators called aeroplanes. But then people, of course, can drop off all over the world. Now, there's been 2 cases of coronavirus confirmed just today in the UK. But the problem is people can also travel to poorer parts of the world with less established health systems. Now, I'm not going to pick out any country, but there's lots of countries which have great deficits in public health and great deficits in individual healthcare. Many poorer countries and many poorer people who don't have the access to the healthcare, and the facilities simply aren't available. So what can happen is people will travel from infected areas to a less developed area without a health system that's going to identify this. And they can get sick and they can infect lots of new people, giving rise to a spread to the pandemic to a poorer area of the world with a less developed health system. And then, of course, from there it's going to spread out. This is why health is not localised. Health respects no borders. It's very international. The coronavirus isn't going to say, "Oh, we're at the border now, we better stop." It's just going to carry on. So a large reservoir of infected people could develop in a poorer country with a less developed health system, which can then travel to other areas of the world. That, to me, is the big risk in this situation. This is why it's so important to try and level up healthcare systems around the world, although we are a long way from that situation. So that is the big risk. Travel via poorer countries, that will spread to the rest of the poorer countries, to other poorer countries, and of course it will spread to Western, more advanced countries, UK, US, Canada, Australia, Europe, potentially as well. That is the fear. Now, I did a video just recently on the pathophysiology of infectious diseases, and we looked at this incubation period, which was from when someone is first infected, the point of infection, up until this point here, when they first get the illness. So this red line is when they first get the illness. So here they feel a little bit sicker, most possible sick there, then they start getting better. So this phase under here is the period of symptomatic illness. So this incubation period here from point of infection to onset of symptoms is the incubation period. And just a couple of days ago we weren't sure how long this was, but now we know that the mean incubation period was 5.2 days. So our initial assumption that we've been working on was 2 to 14 days, and it seems that that is not too far out. Now, in only 5% of the cases did they incubate for longer than 12.5 days. So 14 days quarantine is needed. Now, a few cases, a very small minority of cases, might present after 14 days. But 95% of cases that are going to develop the infection will do so in 12.5 days. So the UK government, for example, is using 14 days quarantine for people flown in from the epicentre of this infection in China. So 14 days are needed. And I have heard some rumours that other governments are using less than 14 days. Well, let's hope they change that very quickly, because this is now based on data. We know that 5% of cases are going to present after 12.5 days. And in its early stages, we now know that the epidemic doubled in size every 7.4 days.
What we've got is 5 people here. We've got the index patient, and we've got patient 1, 2, 3, 4. And this is all happening in Germany, and these are all dates in January here below. Okay? So the first thing that happened here is that there was a business meeting that was occurring, and this index patient here was actually from China. And they flew over to Germany to have and attend a business meeting. And this meeting occurred over the period of the 19th to the 22nd. So who was at that business meeting? Well, these 2 people here who are German natives attended the business meeting with index patients. Everything was fine. Nobody was having symptoms. And the index patient, well, she hopped on a flight on the 22nd here and goes back to China and starts developing symptoms almost immediately after she gets on the flight. Okay? She goes back to China, and of course there's the big rage of what's going on, and she has the symptoms. So what does she do? She goes and gets tested. And she goes and gets tested over here on the 26th. Meanwhile, what happens is patient number 1, who was at the meeting, he starts developing symptoms on the 24th. Mild symptoms. So a cough, fever, malaise, all the sorts of things that you would assume would go along with the flu. And his symptoms get worse, and then they get better. Now, the index patient, she gets tested here on the 26th, PCR. And it's positive. As soon as it gets positive, she goes back and she calls her company, and they do a trace back to try to figure out all the people that she may have come in contact with so they can figure out where to test. And of course, by this point, patient number 1's like, well, yeah, I had a little bit of flu symptoms, but I'm fine now. So they check him the next day on the 27th. Okay? PCR positive. Boom. But he's asymptomatic. He's gotten better from his mild symptoms. They're really not that bad anymore. Nevertheless, they go ahead and they test him. They check for viral loads. They see if there's virus in his saliva, virus in his sputum. And guess what? He has a high viral load, even though he is not symptomatic. In other words, he is contagious. And they find up to 10 to the 8th viral particles per milliliter. That's pretty high. Well, guess what? Patient 2, 3, and 4, they all start developing symptoms as well during the same time. Patient 2's symptoms last a little bit longer, and they test on the 28th. Of course, when he turns out positive, all hell breaks loose, and they're like, wow, what's going on here? And so a whole bunch of other people get tested, and so sure enough, patient 2 has a positive PCR. But remember, this patient number 2 attended the same meetings, and so it's very possible that this is how it worked. Okay? But here's the point that should blow you away. Patient 3 and 4 never attended the meetings. However, patient 3 and 4 did have contact with patient number 1. And they can actually map out when patient 3 and 4 had contact with patient number 1. And all of these contacts were before the patient actually had symptoms. So in other words, 3 and 4 started to develop symptoms, but they started to develop symptoms later, about a day later. So they developed symptoms on January 25th, January 26th. And of course, they got tested with everybody else because they were all freaking out, of course. And sure enough, PCR was positive. So here's the take-home message. Number one, it looks as though the incubation period here is fairly short. So that's a good thing. That means that you're going to find out quickly whether or not the patient has a virus. What's bad about this, though, is that you're able to spread the virus both before and after, it seems, you have symptoms. In fact, we know that patient 3 and 4 got their virus from a patient who got it from the index patient here, and they got it before they had symptoms.
The flu is something that we know how to deal with. We have vaccines for the flu. The flu is a worldwide phenomenon. Every country knows about the flu. Every country is prepared to deal with the flu. The flu is also something very different to the coronavirus. The number of people that have to be hospitalized and put into ICU because of the flu is a very small percentage to the same amount of people that have to be hospitalized and put into the ICU for the coronavirus. This is what's going to be the big problem the world will have to deal with if it gets out of hand. But let's talk about the numbers. People keep throwing this thing about, oh, in China, there's so few deaths from flu. That is also bullshit. In fact, China has a much larger number when it comes to deaths related to flu. But I asked my wife, because she's a Chinese doctor, I asked her, why is it that China only reports 43 or 53 deaths a year from flu? But in the rest of the world, we see these massive numbers, like in America, 50,000, 80,000 a year. And, well, she explained it to me very simply. When somebody goes to the hospital in China with a complication, let's say a heart disease or pneumonia or any other ailment, and they contract the flu, which then exacerbates that ailment and eventually leads to death. On the death certificate, they will write down the cause of death as heart disease or pneumonia or whatever that pre-existing condition was, not as death from the flu. However, in countries like America, if somebody goes in, they have a pre-existing condition, but they die due to complications brought on by the flu, on their death certificate, it will be written, death due to complications brought on by influenza. And so it's marked down as a death caused by flu. We are facing a massive problem here at the moment. And of course, this is going to lead to uncomfortable situations, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't act accordingly. You see, if the roles were reversed and it was the coronavirus coming out of America, it would be very difficult to identify who is American and who isn't, because America's got such a diverse society. You've got black people, brown people, yellow people, green people, whatever kind of people. So if you see someone on the street of your country, you wouldn't be able to point at them and say, he's American, because, like I said, it's difficult to prove. However, because you only get Chinese people in China, it's very easy to point to an Asian person and guess that they could perhaps be Chinese. And this is, of course, leading to a lot of uncomfortable situations where people are seeing an Asian person, no matter if they're from Thailand or Japan or wherever it is, and immediately presuming that they could possibly carrying this coronavirus. Now, this is what we want to try and avoid. But at the same time, we should not be so stupid as to avoid taking precautions. If you are living in an Asian area where there are a lot of Asian people, or if you go and visit Asian supermarkets where you know that there's a possibility that people traveling to and from China recently could be shopping there or going there or studying there or whatever the case, you should take extra precaution. You should wear a mask. You should wash your hands more. It's not racist, it's common sense. If you put yourself and your families at danger just because you are afraid of being labeled a racist, you are a fool. By the same token, I do not condone and I do not want to see people being discriminatory and nasty and racist towards people of Asian ethnicity. It's not fair.
To reiterate, it's the immunocompromised that are most at risk, and even with that, it's worth saying that the numbers are relatively low. If you think about it, 40,000 people died of the flu in the US alone last year, and over 1 million people died of heart disease. On top of that, the death rate right now is being estimated between 2 and 3%, which is continually evolving, but a disease like SARS was a death rate of 10%, and Ebola in some regions has been up to 50%. All this to say, don't allow the news to make you panic.
We live in Toronto, where the SARS virus got world-scale attention. That's because the only people who died outside of Asia from that virus were in Canada, and most of them were in Toronto. With only 44 people dying in total in Canada, it had a huge impact on our city. We lost a lot of tourism, we lost millions of dollars, but most importantly, we saw a lot of stigma and racism towards Chinese people. It's important that we do not repeat those racist notions that happened here in Toronto, and we all need to be aware of this when we talk about the current coronavirus. On our social media channels, we have seen lots of people saying things like, "This always happens in China," and relating it a lot to the types of foods that Chinese people eat. But it's important to remember that Western food practices are what created mad cow disease, and also Western meat consumption has created a big issue with antibiotic resistance. We need to listen to and trust public health professionals, and we need to not overreact, and we need to not use this as an excuse to be racist.